Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event, the book launch and the workshop on Paulo Scott's Phenotypes with Daniel Hahn. This is an event organized by myself, University College London, Claire Williams, who is here from the University of Oxford, and Carmen Vilares from the University of Sheffield. It's a great pleasure to be working with my colleagues from other universities to bring our students together. And of course, to have here Paulo and Danielle, who is going to discuss with you a bit of the translation. And then after the initial workshop on the target text, we are going to have our students reading passages and discussing passages of the source and target text. I would like to remind you about some of the usual Zoom etiquettes. So please try to keep your microphone mute when you're not speaking, and be mindful of background noise. The workshops are recorded, as you know, so you must have already heard and accepted that you are being recorded. And we do share the whole video on social media and internally by the universities and partner institutions. I would like to thank Paulo, Danielle, Stefan Tobler, Katie, Erika Pacheco, and all the others who have been involved in this event. E agora eu passo a palavra para Claire Williams. So Claire Williams is an associate professor in Brazilian studies, and she, among other many things that she has written, she has an article, actually a book chapter on Paulo Scott's work. Claire, por favor.
Thank you, Anna. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. I'm going to do a brief introduction to Paulo Scott and to this book, and also an introduction to Danielle, and then pass over to him. So Paulo Scott comes from Porto Alegre in southern Brazil. At university in the late 1980s, he was an active member of the student political movement, and he was also involved in Brazil's redemocratization process. For 14 years, he taught law at university. He has now published 6 books of fiction, 7 of poetry, as well as a graphic novel. And his short story collection, Ainda Orangotangos, was turned into a film. His novels deal head-on with social and political issues through a focus on particular individual characters, the choices they make, and the repercussions of those choices years later. They capture the idealism of youth and the disillusionment of middle age. His novel of 2012, Habitante Irreal, Nowhere People, made visible the challenges facing indigenous people in 21st century Brazil. The novel being launched today, Marrom e Amarelo, Phenotypes, deals with attitudes to skin color in contemporary Brazil, deep-rooted prejudices, and attempts to change society through affirmative action and university quotas. It's the story of 2 mixed-race brothers who are as different in temperament as they are in skin tone. Shimmers with anger and anxiety. The text is surprising, shocking even, yet absolutely compulsive reading, perhaps because it's not unrelentingly pessimistic. There are moments of humor, also because the action is focused on a series of scenes and intense conversations, including text messages, which play out in front of the reader like tense drama. It's a disturbing narrative, recording both acts of outright racism and microaggressions, and the psychological scars they leave. But it also looks at institutional racism in the police force and the legal and bureaucratic hurdles faced by those who challenge authority. Echoed by Paulo Scott's style, the interweaving of past and present, the slow piecing together of the plot, meandering sentences, the length of a page, minimal punctuation, the predominance of direct speech, and the attention to detail, as well as the difference between the way preppy white kids and working class black kids dress and their trainers, the brand of their trainers even. He states addresses and street names so the reader can follow the action on a map if they want to. Very specific meals from specific restaurants and references to popular culture, especially music. It's almost as though the novel has its own soundtrack. It means to be a black person or be considered black by others and by oneself. Scott shows how in a society marked by inequality in its institutions and legislation, in love relationships, and even within the family unit, things are never simply black and white, black or white. An introduction to the novel, trying not to spoil too much about the story. Now I'm going to say a few words about Daniel Hahn, who's a prolific writer, editor, and translator with 80-something books to his name, including reference books and children's literature. And he's done a huge amount to promote literature in translation in this country, including participating at book fairs and festivals and events like this, and also training translators. So as one of the directors of the British Centre for Literary Translation for 4 years and a chair of the Translators Association. In addition to Paulo Scott's Phenotypes, his recent translations from Portuguese include Julian Fuchs's Occupation, Gonçalo M. Tavares' Plague Diary, and collections of short stories by José Eduardo Agualusa and Machado de Assis. It's almost like there are very few people he hasn't translated yet. He also translated Paulo's novel Habitante Irreal. He translated it as Nowhere People, and that came out in 2014 for And Other Stories. And you can read about his roller coaster experience translating that novel on the translation website Asymptote. So now, Daniel, can you please tell us a little bit about what the experience of translating this novel brought to you?
I will. Thanks, Claire, and hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here. And it's a great pleasure to talk with Paulo and all of you about this really wonderful book that just came out about a month ago in the English translation. As Claire mentioned, I translated Paulo's previous book some years ago, Habitante Irreal, which in some ways prepared me for the challenges of this book. And in some ways, nothing could have prepared me for the challenges of this book. One of the things which the asymptote piece, which Claire mentioned, which I wrote when I was translating the first book, I talked quite a lot about the stylistic issues, about those sentences Claire talks about how you kind of integrate that with voice, because this feels like a very kind of voicey sort of novel. I talked a little bit about the issues of very particular culture. Again, Claire said something about there being, details of specific meals and specific restaurants and specific corners of specific streets and music. I referenced this kind of soundtrack that you have with you when you're reading. And there are, of course, two problems with that kind of situation when you're translating. One of them is figuring out what is going on if it's a culture that is not yours. And I'm not from Porto Alegre, and I haven't been to these places. I have a very obliging author, and I have Google and various other resources, but that first issue is figuring out what is happening in the original novel, and the second is figuring out how to tell that story for an audience who also don't have these reference points, who won't necessarily know what this food is, or if someone walks from place A to place B, if your reader in Porto Alegre knows that that is a 3-minute walk or a 6-hour walk, that may not be obvious to a reader outside Porto Alegre, even in anywhere else in Brazil. So there are, those kind of cultural issues which I had to figure out, which to some extent apply in every translation. There are the issues to do with those big sentences Claire mentioned, which you will see in the passages we're going to look at in a moment. And those sentences are really tricky, not because very long sentences are inherently difficult. I don't think they are. I think very long sentences can be as easy as anything else. I think one of the things that's tricky about this is that these are sentences that are not only long, but they're complex. But despite being complex, they also have to have a kind of propulsion. I think Claire said, like there's a kind of compulsive reading. There has to be something that keeps you going. So these can't just be very tangled things that slow you down. There has to be some kind of momentum to them, despite the fact that the sentence may be 3 pages long and have subclauses and things that come back 8 lines below that pick up where you were in the sentence 8 lines earlier. So there's a real complexity to those sentences. And they're also, and again, I hope this will become clear when you look at the passages today. Claire mentioned that there's quite a lot of dialogue, which I think is right, and certainly that's the second passage we have today is a very dialogue heavy. It's mostly just people talking, but actually I think a lot of the novel, probably all of the novel, is in voice. Even when it's not in dialogue, there's a really particular voice, and that changes. So what we will see in the 2 pieces you'll see today, there are 2 bits of long, complex sentences, but I think the diction of them is completely different. I think the rhythm of them is completely different, despite the fact that they are long and winding and slightly hard to kind of get a grip on. And so one of the challenges then is making these sentences complex and also propulsive, but also distinctive, because I think that the novel, even though as it were, the unit of the novel, the sentences, the interesting unit is a sentence rather than a paragraph or a word. But at the same time, the kind of rhythms of the sentences change enormously depending on who is the character we're looking at, when are we, where are we, and who is talking if somebody is talking. Along with the culture and the sentences, the third, probably quite obvious thing that was a challenge in this particular book was to do with race specifically, and to do with the language of race. The book is about the experience of being a Black person in Brazil. It's about the experience of being, as Claire said, being seen by oneself or by other people as a Black person or as a white person. But it's also about the language that is used. It's about what do people call each other? What are the words that are used? It runs right the way through the book. And obviously the moment you're translating something about language, you are set up for, I won't say set up to fail, so don't think we failed, but you're set up for a problem. Because we know that languages they don't map onto each other identically, and there is no word in one language that maps precisely onto a word in another. And that's particularly the case in language that is very loaded, and language that is very culturally and historically contingent, including, of course, the language of race. And so there are words for that characters use to describe themselves when they say that they are Black in this novel and in Brazil, which don't exactly map onto the words that we use in English. And when I say the words that we use in English, that's also different depending on if you're in the south of England or Detroit or in Canberra or in Dublin or anywhere else you might be in the world. English itself is it kind of jumps around a lot based on, again, historical and cultural contingencies. So this third problem was figuring out how to represent, not even to translate, but how to represent this conversation in the book, which is a conversation about words, a conversation about language. Carmen, who selected the pieces for us to talk about today, very cunningly chose pieces which have all 3 of these problems. But there are cultural issues, there are nightmare sentences, and there is a question about kind of the language of race, which has that latter thing particularly has all kinds of implications for the sort of ethics of those of us who are in this business, and those of us who, especially as a white translator, agreeing to translate this book. So that's the sort of those are the problems. We have these 2 passages, which I hope you've had a chance to look at. I think some of you will have read the book, some of you will have just read these passages, but I hope you've had a chance at least to look at the passages in the handout. I wonder whether maybe we should ask Paulo just very briefly to introduce, just to give some context just for these two passages? I think that might be quite useful because they fit into really particular moments in the main character's experience, I guess. And it's quite hard to understand the voice that we're trying to create without knowing that. Paula, do you mind doing that? Would you say a little bit about?
Please, Danny.
Oh, me.
Okay. No, sorry.
You.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here again with Daniel. I'm not sure about my connection. I'm in a hotel in a small town in near Porto, Cidade de Porto, here in Portugal. I'm happy to talk about this book that tells a very important story to me, because I created this fiction connecting with my family experience. So okay, Daniel, actually when you were speaking, I was not quite connection. Which passage do you want me to talk about?
So the two passages, one of them, the two passages in the workshop, one of them is actually, I wonder, is someone going to bring it up? That's even better. There we are. That's easy.
Okay.
That's the first one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is the commission chapter. I think this is part of the novel that I consider, I think, is the melting pot, is the core where I put many ideas that came after very strong research I did with leadership, with activists in the Black cause there in Brazil, and I put in the quite dystopic sense this mirror that Brazilians can't look through because it is really difficult. This kind of solution in this moment in Brazil. This is the year when this policy will be questioned again, because they created it to begin in 2012, and this year, 2022, our parliament will decide with the quotas will still on or not. So let me see which part is this. Okay.
It's one of the reasons I really like this extract, Paul, is because it's talking about the kind of fragmentation of the different groups, and it's the most sort of, hitting you over the head way of showing the complexity of this. It's not just these people against these people. It's actually a much more complex and in some ways a much more toxic mixture of groups and subgroups who change their minds and who are hostile towards each other. And actually, one of the things that happens even in this piece is that I talked about the voice sort of changing in these long sentences. And there's one bit, I wonder, Anna, should I read the translation, do you think?
Okay.
Sorry, Anna, you're mute, but I can see that you're talking.
I don't manage to unmute me with the screen on. I can't see all the buttons to press, and I'm always afraid to press the end button.
Don't press the end button, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I actually, if Paulo could read the first passage in Portuguese, and then Daniel, you could read it in English, that would be good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I just would like to say sorry about that, Daniel. I was reading a message that I received in this moment here that shocked me. I was managing this when you invite me to talk. I wasn't prepared, so it was my mistake. Okay, I will read now. Nem um mês depois das primeiras denúncias de radicalizações por parte dos alunos negros, veio a explosão, alunos brancos se dizendo parte de algum dos inúmeros grupos de intolerância racial inspirados nas teses da supremacia da raça branca, grupos que começaram a fervilhar na internet depois dos ataques contra as Torres Gêmeas em Nova York, no 11 de setembro de 2001, que atacavam as cotas contra alunos pretos, pardos e indígenas, beneficiados pelo sistema de cotas, alunos brancos que não faziam parte de nenhum grupo fundado em argumento de supremacia racial, mas que, adeptos do discurso da meritocracia, eram opositores convictos do sistema de cotas raciais para estudantes de qualquer fenótipo, contra alunos pretos e pardos, alunos brancos que eram a favor das cotas, mas que com a convivência em sala de aula com alunos cotistas se tornaram opositores das cotas, contra alunos pretos, pardos, indígenas, alunos brancos, mais ou menos comedidos, que declaravam não ter certeza sobre a universidade ser lugar de índio, contra alunos indígenas, alunos brancos nada comedidos, dizendo abertamente que se índio queria terra demarcada, então que ficasse nas ruas, nas suas terras demarcadas, que não viesse atrapalhar a vida dos civilizados, contra alunos indígenas, alunos brancos desfavoráveis às cotas, contra alunos brancos favoráveis às cotas, alunos brancos a favor das cotas, contra alunos brancos inimigos das cotas, alunos brancos que eram contra as cotas, mas que, com a convivência em sala de aula com alunos negros cotistas, se tornaram a favor das cotas, contra alunos brancos opositores das cotas, alunos negros contra alunos brancos em reação, alunos indígenas contra alunos brancos em reação, alunos pardos claros contra alunos pretos e alunos pardos escuros em reação.
That's not possibly the easiest thing to read aloud. Here we go. This is what it sounds like in the translation we published, which anyone who has seen me do a reading before will know that I edit as we go, so I will improve the translation in real time now if I can. Not a month after the first accusations and radicalizations on the part of the black students came the explosion, with white students who claimed membership of any of the countless groups motivated by racial intolerance and inspired by the theories of white supremacy that started to bubble up on the internet following the attack on the Twin Towers in New York on September 11th, 2001, attacking quotas against the black, brown and indigenous students who benefited from the quota system, and white students who weren't part of any group founded on an argument of racial supremacy, but who, being fans of the discourse of meritocracy, were staunch opponents of the system of racial quotas for students of any phenotype, against black and brown students, and white students who had initially been in favor of the quotas, but who, having shared a classroom with quota students, had become opponents of quotas against black, brown, and indigenous students, and some more or less moderate white students who said they weren't sure whether a university was the proper place for an Indian, against indigenous students and white students who weren't moderate at all and said openly that if Indians wanted demarcated lands, then they should damn well stay in their demarcated lands, not come here complicating the lives of civilized people. Against indigenous students and white students averse to quotas, against white students favorable towards quotas, and white students who had been against quotas, but who, having shared a classroom with black quota students, have now come out in favor of quotas, against white students who were opponents of quotas, and black students against white students in response, indigenous students against white students in response, and in response, light-skinned brown students against black students and dark-skinned brown students. I thought I'm going to mention two particular words in here. And then if people have questions or comments or suggestions or objections or whatever, it would be nice to get people's feedback or thoughts. But I thought I'd draw attention to two words. One of them is the word phenotype, which exists about the third 10 lines down, which is in the original and which is in the translation. And it seems to me, only reading it now, that the word phenotype in the translation and the word phenotype in the original are entirely different, because the second one is also the title of the book. And the moment you put phenotypes on the cover of the book, I think it changes the weight that that word has in the English text. Every time the word phenotype exists in the English text, it rings a little bell, because it's the thing that's in big, it's on the spine and on the cover. And I just noticed that difference now. The other thing which I thought I would mention in relation to this particular text is you see that the word Indian appears on two occasions, relating to the word Inju in Paulo's text. And that's one of those moments where I feel what I was saying earlier, that I think that even though this is kind of one coherent sentence, I feel like the voice shifts around quite a lot in this sentence. Because actually, I think, see if I can find this here, the person where it says white students who said they weren't sure whether a university was the proper place for an Indian. The word chosen there is the word which is in the voice of those people who are speaking. Just as two lines later, white students who weren't moderate at all and said openly that if Indians wanted demarcated land, they should damn well stay in their demarcated lands. And again, that word there, it's the word indigenous is used elsewhere in this paragraph and elsewhere in the book. The word Indian is not a word that I would use for this meaning, that I think the author would use, that I think our editors would use, and I suspect most people on this call would not use. But there's a little bit of someone else's voice embedded in this sentence. And it's really striking. I think I felt that when I was reading it aloud, that you suddenly notice that you've got this kind of bureaucratic, and the white people doing this and the black people doing this, and whites against blacks and blacks against indigenous. And then you suddenly have, if Indians want a demarcated land, they should just damn well stay. And that's suddenly a whole other voice, which is somehow kind of hidden in this sentence. And that kind of comes back to what I was saying at the beginning about how these sentences are actually much more complicated than just, very, very long sentences with lots of bits to them. That I think tonally there's a really subtle sometimes, but really precise shift within the sentences. And actually, even though this doesn't have any he said and she said, it doesn't have any speech marks, there's no direct speech, but I think you can hear several different people talking in this one. The second passage we're going to look at is a bit of dialogue. So it says he said, and then there's someone else talking, and then I said, and there's someone else talking, and those voices are demarcated much more obviously. But I think it's very subtle here. But I think that's why those words are there in the Portuguese, and that's why those words are there. Those words are there in the English. Anyway, I mentioned that because it just occurred to me while I was reading it.
Yeah, that's a very important point. I think there's subtle difference is marked by you. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, if you allow me to make a comment, I think that passage advances the whole distribution of voices that comes straight after, when the group of civil servants are discussing in their committee and expressing their opinion of what to be done, etc. So I think that it's quite emblematic that you manage to summarize and bring together so many voices and make the beginning of the novel already so polyphonic, and expands that as the novel progresses and new voices are added and given even more space. So I really liked the passage that comes after, in which these people come together and present their own ideas, and makes it very difficult for us to read. I had to put chapter numbers in every passage. I had to putting subtitles for the sections, etc. But it's very interesting that somehow synthesizes the structure that comes afterwards, at least for me.
And there's also something which is about the tone in this passage and what comes afterwards, which is that some of it's really funny, and it's funny because it's so preposterous sometimes. It's an incredibly serious subject, and people are trying to do serious things, and it's difficult, and some of the conversations are really offensive, but also it's so ludicrous sometimes. And you see that in this kind of fragmented thing we've just read, but also in the pages that follow, as Anna said, when you see all of the different people presenting their points of view, deeply held points of view, with these extraordinary kind of small differences between them. But some of it is actually, in a terrible and dark way, quite funny, because it's so ludicrous, some of what we see.
The point is, in this commission, all agree with the quotas. So you can see how different perspectives you can find around this subject, these issues. And most of these opinions I got from the Black leaders, because they have different perspective. If you are brown, they think if you are real Black, some of them, of course, think that the policies that this real Black people has to receive a different treatment because they suffer more than others. So there isn't one view, a consensus, a mutual. There isn't one way out of this. So the problem in my country is that we don't want to discuss about that. So that's a real problem, because we prefer say that we are a democracy, racial democracy. That's a big lie. And this is our tragedy, because if you take off the racism of our cultural structure, our economic system, this disappear in the air, because Brazil was grow from this unequal system. And we don't want to discuss about that, because it hurts us, to see in this mirror. So I think this commission chapter, Daniel, is a kind of moment that reflects this fed up moment of the protagonist. So the history begins from this point, from this spot. Yeah. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Laura. Nice to see you. Hello.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to say something or to mention something. First of all, it's wonderful to be among such brilliant people. But just before you made the comment, Daniel, about some passages being quite funny, that's exactly what I was going to say. I noticed that I laughed out loud when you were reading the English translation. And I wondered why, because I didn't laugh at the Portuguese. And I think it was exactly the word Indian that was misplaced. And it makes their voice so much more ridiculous. If those Indians want this and that. And that just shows how complicated translation is, and how, you really have to look at each word. And I think that was a strike of genius. That word Indian just made it, that group gave it a voice and made it sound ridiculous. That was my point. But then you said it yourself.
Thanks, Laura. I think I think you're right. There are certain, and especially a word like that, which can really kind of detonates in a text, doesn't it? And so you have to be incredibly careful, I think, how you use it. And there are worse words, I think, in this book elsewhere. I'm interested that you found it funnier somehow in the English and the Portuguese, and I think that's my fault, because I have had this problem before, that I've translated things and they've turned out to be funnier than they were supposed to be, because I find it hard to resist, and I apologize to anyone who laughed at places and they didn't laugh in the Portuguese.
No, I think that's wonderful, Daniel. I think that enriching, it's actually makes the what Paulo was just saying, that Brazilians maybe we're not so willing to discuss, and that goes through even language. And by you doing this, we can see even more so how ridiculous it is, that argument that, if the Indians want this, if the Indians want that. I think that just shows something that we resist to see.
Thanks.
It was meant as a compliment.
Gabriella.
Yes, sorry, I was trying to unmute me. Sorry, I didn't know how to raise the hands. I'm I have this back screen ridiculous that I can't take it out, and I can't raise my hand there as well. So, but I just had the question about the word Indians, that I just thought when you were, Daniel, when you were referring to that word. Because I think one of the problems of that word is that in English, it refers to both people from India, which is in Portuguese, indianos, right? And also people from the indigenous areas in Brazil, for instance, which is the Índios. So in Portuguese, we have two words, right? Whereas in English, I think it's the same word, right? I'm not sure about this, but I think probably an English public will, I don't know, assume that Indian is people from India. I don't know. Maybe they can make that misunderstanding. I'm not sure about it. I'm just asking because I don't know.
It's partly to do with who is using the word and how offensive we think they're being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it certainly was used more and is still used in some cases by people to talk about indigenous groups in lots of parts of across the Americas. It's not a word that I would use for that. It's a word that someone of my grandparents' generation would have used for an indigenous person, for a First Nations person, for a Native American tribe. It's a word that had that meaning, but is not used, I hope, with any comfort now. It's not in any way a neutral word for that, in a way that it is for someone from the country of India. But yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, there is a difference in the valence, not only in the different things it can mean, but also the extent to which it is more or less acceptable and more or less offensive, which is really different in the two languages. And also, I think, is different in different parts of the English-speaking world, as it is different in different parts of the Portuguese-speaking world. I think in Brazil and in Portugal, you'd use them quite differently, use that word quite differently as well. Which is part of the problem, that you have a word that seems to be doing the same thing in the two languages, but actually is not at all doing the same thing in the two languages. At one point, we talked about keeping all of the words in Portuguese that refer to race, keeping them in Portuguese, and just having Portuguese words which the characters use to identify themselves, identify each other. But then you run into the fact that actually words that look the same have a huge difference for historical and cultural reasons, in how they've been used in these two different languages and across these two different languages. And as a result, the offense that they cause, the biases in them, So yes, it is complicated. Is a not very good summary of this situation.
I think there's a question by Sarah, and after Sarah we can move to the second excerpt, and then Elton, if you don't mind waiting to interact when we were talking about the second excerpt. Sarah?
Thanks very much. Yeah, just a really brief comment, and also just quickly to say thanks so much, Paulo and Daniel and everybody for organising this amazing event. And Daniel, congratulations on your amazing translation for, oh my goodness, such a challenging text. My two comments. I was going to ask a question really similar to Gabriella about Indian, and it's just there's no answer. I mean, it's so interesting to hear your thoughts, Daniel, on that. But I wanted to comment on that on Indian. That one thing that really struck me reading the English was that you used a capital I, and whereas for the other the terms like black, indigenous, you used a lowercase letter. And I was just wondering if just for you to comment something about the considerations to do with that, because I know I'm not sure about UK English, but I know that, for example, in a US English text, it's very, very common now in contemporary language to use a capital letter for B. And it struck me with the I of Indian that it then immediately took me as a reader to the thought of the nationality Indian, like someone from India. So that kind of stopped me in the flow of the reading a little bit, and I felt like only because I know Portuguese, I understood that it meant that it was like the derogatory, the other levels of indigenous. So that was just something I thought was quite interesting for you to ask you to comment on. And the other thing I wanted to ask for a quick comment on is about the word brown. I think you kind of answered that in what you just said, that there's so many different layers, and that will be so many different layers of the word brown in English and the word pardo in Brazilian Portuguese. But that's something that always is really like one of the most challenging things, I think, in one of the words that's so challenging now. And I was going to ask about whether you'd considered things like leaving it in Portuguese or using italics, but I think you kind of basically answered that already in your comments. But just for a quick comment on any of those considerations would be really interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, you put your finger on one of the most difficult parts of this book, which is choosing those words that are going to represent words in a language, which are not just words in another language, but which are words in a whole other world. And it's one of the things I wrote sort of afterward to this book, to explain a number of things, but partly to explain that. The difficulty I had, I suppose, is on the first in the first instance thinking, what is, if you like, the equivalent in English? So what is a word that is equivalent in terms of meaning, but also in terms of, well, meanings in the plural sometimes, but in terms of tone, in terms of how offensive or acceptable we find it, who would use that kind of word? And the reason that's a problem is partly because, of course, that doesn't exist. There is no word that maps onto another. And then one of the things that I started thinking as I was getting kind of tangled up in that question, how do I differentiate between, two or really three different words in Portuguese, all of which, if you look them up in the dictionary, will say black? How do I differentiate between those in English? And one of the conclusions I came to is actually it's not my job to try and find an equivalent in English. It's my job to find a way of replicating what is happening in the Portuguese and to be as truthful as I can about this really particular experience of race and racism and identity and self-determination that are in the book, rather than trying to find an equivalent set of words that fit it into the discourse of London or New York or wherever. Because actually, I think pretending that the discourse around these words is the same in every language would be entirely false. So I then have to come up with an alternative. As I say, the issue, one possibility was using the Portuguese words, italicizing them and leaving them in English. But you then have words that have different. The word mulato exists in both, but they have completely different weights because they have different cultures behind them. They're used in different ways. The word negro appears for black many times in the novel in Portuguese. If I use that Portuguese word in English, it would look like an English word, which I would use only with very great care, and which again conveys completely the wrong thing. And it relates to your first question, Sarah, about the kind of capitalizing. One of the things that we toyed with is whether we should differentiate between preto and negro, these two words meaning black, essentially by having one of them with a lowercase b and one with an uppercase b, where the first one is simply color, and you would use it for everything of that color, the background, screen, and objects, as well as colors of people's skin, and the other is racial and cultural and is identity. And so we toyed with having black with lowercase and black with uppercase to correspond to those things. But then we thought, actually, again, trying to fit it into a discourse that we're comfortable with in our language and in our moment would be really misleading. If you have a character in the 1980s who may be quite explicitly racist, deliberately using an uppercase B for black, that, it seemed to me, would be favoring the wrong thing, because it's trying to find a way of replicating, trying to find a way of using an alternate, a kind of equivalent in English, but actually would tell you entirely the wrong things about what is offensive, about who has power, about the history and the culture of these words. And so we ended up going for something which in some ways now I think probably looks like the simplest solution, which is not to try and do anything clever at all, and just show what the Portuguese is doing. And then where it says pardo, it always says brown in English. There's more than one word for that, because the original title has the word marrom in it, which also means brown, but as it were means brown in a completely different way to the word brown means brown in English. So yeah, I mean, just I'm glad it's done.
Wow, excellent. So interesting, these considerations.
Thank you.
Excellent.
I wonder if I may ask you something about the second passage, Daniel. Because much the same way as you have yes, please, Anna, please put the second passage up. In much the same way as you have the trickiness of translating racial language or not in the first passage. In the second passage, you also have street speech. And my question is, when I was looking at this, I was thinking, do I go Gangs of New York? Do I go London? Who do I channel here? And I was wondering if you could make me, if you could maybe talk through how you chose to translate, because you go from bro to man when addressing Federico. I think I'll stop my question there.
Thanks, Carmen. I'll say, I know we're short of time, but can I just, even if it's very quick, can I just read this thing through in English? I mean, you can't read it slowly. It has to be quick anyway. That's how this is written. So it will inevitably be quick. Right. Bro, let me tell you this. You kind of think you're something special, right? Must be fun to pose as a spokesman for the crowd. King of abstract theory, the leading man, Tarzan, Lord of the Apes. Go on, tell me, I've come to check on all the chimps. Have a bit of a laugh with the chimps. He looked around and then back at me. Well, you were on your phone, I got to remembering. And I thought it weird, you being Lorenzo's brother, because he's a black man, and man, you're seriously fucking white. And I thought if you were brothers, despite him being dark brown colored and you white like a heart of palm, if he's cool, then you must be cool too. And that's why that one time I tried to start a conversation with you. But you looked at me, oh, so superior, like someone who thought he was better than me, who thought he was better than everybody. And you just said one line to me. Do you remember? He asked. No, I'm sure you don't. You said, you didn't give to beggars. And you said to a 10-year-old kid who just wanted to ask how your brother was doing, that you didn't give to beggars. Do you have any idea how arrogant you are? You were what, maybe 16 years old, 17. You had your health, you had a father and mother who must have given you everything. You had brains, and you couldn't chat with a kid who just wanted a bit of attention, he said. Caio, look, I'm not here to hurt anyone. If I messed up with you, 3 decades back. I'm sorry. I think I got a bit better between then and now. And I'm sorry, really, I said. But I've come here to your bar because I heard it was a cool place, because in my day there wasn't a cool place like this round here in the neighborhood, I said. Here in the neighborhood, he said. Right, the neighborhood. Man, tell me what work you've done for the black kids here in Blackburn on these last 10 years, these last 15 years, he asked. Man, you don't do crap for your neighborhood, he said. I got out of the shit because I got given a chance and I didn't let go, he said. That's great, I replied. And having got out of the shit is what gives me permission to tell any sucker I see when I meet one who thinks he's really killing it, that he's just not, he said. Thank you for the tip, I said. Man, you're so stuck up, Federico, always were. Look at the color of your skin. Look at your hair, the way you wear that slicked back hair you got. You got that white shell of yours, that totally fucking access all areas skin. You're never going to understand what it is to be black, to be a poor fucker getting hassled 24/7 on your street, in your neighborhood, in your city. You don't know. Totally stuck up. And so, buddy, you'd best not relax. Today you're here, you're all good here in the Guitar Man, you're going to see the 80s show, but don't you relax. And best lose that attitude of yours, that profound mental trip of yours as this righteous do-gooder. You're worthless, man. You don't know what it is to be part of the race. Don't start getting ideas about being some defender of the cause, you cretin, palm-heart, opportunist piece of shit. And think 3 times before you come back here again, because if you do and I'm here, the shit can end up real bad for you. Keep your wits about you. And he threw back the shot glass of vodka he'd already poured. I gave him a pat on the shoulder and an, okay, great, I'll see you around, and moved away from the bar, headed for the back of the room. It's good, this book, isn't it? It's really fun. It surprised me. Paulo and I did an event recently, and I was really surprised to discover what a pleasure it is to read this thing aloud, at least the bits that work, because they have that kind of repulsiveness to them. The answer to your question, particularly, Catherine, is I don't know. That's the honest answer. And it comes from, there are a number of factors. One of the factors is I am a British person working with an American editor. And so I think there is a bit of all kinds of Englishes, because I also have traveled and read, and I like Englishes from lots of places. I've spent time in lots of different countries. And I think there are some of Jeremy, the editor, some of his fingerprints on there, not only particular word choices, but also things that are not in this translation, because he will have marked them as being weirdly English, London English. And so part of it is that. One of the things that it comes back to what we were saying before the event started about how things get translated between Portugal and Brazil. You know, how spelling and vocabulary gets adjusted. And one of the things that's curious about working with a publisher like And Other Stories, who are based in the UK, but who publish a single edition everywhere. So this is the edition you will buy anywhere in the English-speaking world. If you buy Paulo's novel, you will get this edition, this translation. And so one way or another, that it has to work for speakers of English, whether they're in India or New Zealand or South Africa or anywhere else. And so part of it comes down to what we can get away with, I think. And part of it comes down to rhythm and words I like. And, you know, not every expletive or interjection in my translation corresponds even to where there is one in Paulo's text, because I'm putting things in for a rhythm that, even though I've never read that aloud before, so when I'm editing, I'm reading it aloud in my head. And I noticed there are even things like, well, in the text, it's the bottom of the page. You probably can't see in the extract, but there's a line, while you're on your phone, I got to remembering, and I thought it weird you being Lourenço's brother. That word and I thought it weird you being Lourenço's brother. That word and doesn't exist in the Portuguese. The reason it's there in the English and this is going to sound really silly, there are lots of ands in this book that do not exist in the Portuguese. And one of the reasons they're there is because I need you as a reader to know that this is the beginning of a sentence. I need you to know there's a pause, because the punctuation doesn't tell you that it's the beginning of a sentence, because Paulo doesn't do that. And in Portuguese, it's obvious that this is the beginning of a sentence because the word I, you capitalize in the beginning of a sentence and you don't if you don't. In English, the word I, you have no way of knowing whether that's in the middle of a sentence or the beginning of a sentence. And the only way of making it clear is by sticking an extra word in beforehand. And I started doing this. I translated another book for another story called I Don't Expect Anyone to Believe Me, by a Mexican writer, Juan Pablo Villalobos. And I was frantically adding in lots of words and places just in order to be able to capitalize something, just so that you could indicate in a way that's really clear in the Portuguese where there is a sentence break. And it's not clear in the English because the word I, you have no choice but to capitalize even if it's not the sentence beginning. So that's not that. I'm now long past answering your question, Carmen, except to say that the factors that go into deciding which word you choose and what goes where are not always obvious and possibly not always advisable. Thank you.
Thank you for that, because I mean, one of the things I'm very conscious of is that I'm already of a certain age and I don't have youth speak, and therefore to render that into youth speak would be completely impossible. So it's quite impressive what you managed.
Well, I mean, fortunately, I couldn't do that either, but fortunately, these are not people who are teenagers now. These are people who are roughly my generation. You know, Paulo and I are not many years apart, and the main character was a teenager in the 80s. I was a teenager in the late 80s and early 90s. What I've done here is not in any way a plausible reconstruction of what someone who is a teenager now would sound like. I could try that, probably not very successfully, but it wouldn't sound like this. These are people who are now 2016, 2017, but who are in their 40s at this point, who and so that the kind of influences on their language and the kind of rhythms on their speech are not a kind of completely different generation from me. I found, by the way, I found a typo while I was reading, and I found a typo which I will have to check, but I suspect has probably been here since my first draft. And if it's been here since my first draft, it means that I made this mistake. I then edited it 97,000 times. Jeremy edited it, copy editor edited it, proofreader read it. And this wretched word still appears in this fucking novel.
Which will make the first edition very expensive.
Yes, so if you could please all buy as many copies as you can of the first edition.
And I'll make a correction.
I'll
sell for £2,000 in 2 years, okay? I think it's gonna be.
What's the page, Daniel?
133, 4 lines from the bottom. Having got out the shit is what gives me permission to tell any sucker I see when I meet one who thinks he's really killing it. When I meet one who he thinks he's, that doesn't make any sense. And I think that who he thinks he's, I think it must have at some point when I was drafting it, I think that the sentence must have been structured differently. Because when I meet one who he thinks he's really killing it, is at least one word there shouldn't be there. And yet there it is, apparently. Never mind. Publishing is an imperfect business, I should say this. We love it, but it's not a science.
Elton, I think you have a question, yes?
Paulo, I have a question for you, but just a comment before. I think this bilingual reading, comparative reading, is a brilliant illustration of the way translation inevitably changes everything, inevitably involves making substantial changes in the source text. And you see Otário Arigó translated by Sucker, and Metidão translated by Stuck Up, and it just obviously, I presume that your readers, Daniel, your translation mostly designed for monolingual readers. Is that correct? So we have an extra perspective, an extra sense of how brilliant actually is the work you've done with Paulo's text. But Paulo, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your narrative technique, these endless, highly digressive sentences that build up in one another and create these magical, hypnotizing effects. And they give often a sense of the irony as well of the subject you're dealing with. How do you set up to even begin a sentence like this? And I know Daniel mentioned that they are not necessarily difficult to translate, and perhaps the fact that they have so many endless independent clauses, one leading to another. But these clauses, I think we spoke about that before, Paulo, they generally are dependent on the clause that is immediately before. So perhaps that's why Daniel also thinks it's not as difficult to translate. However, so a question for you is, if you could speak a bit more, how do you set up to write a sentence like this? And for Daniel is, since they are not exceedingly difficult to translate, and maybe they are not, but the question of the tone, after you do, let's say, the first, second level of translation, how do you then proceed? What is your strategy to then tune the piece and to modulate the tone within these endless sentences?
Thank you for your question, Elton. I'm trying to stay focused, but I'm distracted here in this hotel room.
Paulo, se você preferir falar em português.
Someone called me again on the phone here. You know, I'm quite busy today because today is my panel. I'm performing the first panel of the festival, and I gave some interviews. So, you know, I cut the lunch to stay here. So this is a very easy answer to me, dear Elton, because I see myself as a poet. So my poems have this rhythm. I mean, these are poems, but they have this prose tone, you see. So I like this connection, you know, and in this specific novel, I think it worked a lot because the character has this rush, this anger, this urgency. So I think that I couldn't build in a different way. I think this Federico's protagonist of the novel, he asks for this kind of rhythm. And I think that if you see the novel with two paths, I mean, two lines, two main narrative lines, you see that he never forgot that day in 1984. So he has this problem with that day because the day changed him. So I think that I'm so distracted. Sorry. I'm sorry about that. You know.
Não tem problema. Se quiser falar em português, pode falar, tá?
No, but I know someone can understand Portuguese. I will keep in my English. So I think this flow sometimes shows how difficult it is for Federico understand where he did mistakes, and he's trying. This is a novel of the return of the Federico to his past, and for the first time he could deal with that situation that he forgot. So I think the rush, and the anger of the character ask this both things ask for the solution. Of course, you can see some similar structure in Nowhere People, but you see that in Nowhere People it worked different. You can breathe more there. You can breathe breath in Phenotypes. But this is an easy answer to me, because I think the strange. I think that this different situation to the character, because it is a moment he took the novel took a moment that changed him, and showed the other moment in his life where he can realize what happened, I think. So the shock between these two moments are asked to me this kind of solution. I don't think this as a strategy. I think that it's the way I found to tell the story. I don't think much about that. I just think that it fits, and that's it.